What's going on, it's the Polygon Don, and today I want to show you guys what I consider to be the top 20 underrated and in some cases obscure Western RPGs on the PS4. Don't expect The Witcher 3, Fallout or any of the other big hitters. This list is strictly for the unsung heroes of the genre. So whether you've just finished your marathon Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough, or are into your Souls-likes, turn-based or indie RPGs and want something a little more under the radar, then chances are you'll find something of interest here. So now that that's all cleared up, let's dive in. Immortal Unchained is a third-person action RPG developed by Toadman Interactive and released in 2018. Taking quite a bit of inspiration from the Dark Souls series, it was one of the earlier titles to be dubbed Souls with Guns, and while visually it takes on a dark and moody sci-fi vibe, its setting and plot are inspired by Norse mythology and the events of Ragnarok. At the beginning of time, the 9 realms and 9 races were created by the Monolith, a stone artifact at the centre of the universe that is the source of all creation. Taking the role of an unnamed prisoner, you'll be released by the Monolith's caretaker, Aras, and asked to assist in repairing the Monolith by restoring 3 Nexus orbs from which it draws its power. That's the setup anyway. It does get a bit more twisty than that, touching on familiar themes of betrayal and power-hungry factions, etc., but it's not the deepest story out there, and if you're already a fan of Norse mythology, then it won't be anything you aren't already familiar with. Gameplay-wise, as I mentioned, it borrows a lot of tropes from the Soulsborne series. You have movement that is dependent on a stamina bar, an emphasis on dodging to avoid incoming attacks, and a certain level of difficulty that will require you to familiarise yourself with enemy attack patterns. The main difference is that instead of primarily focusing on melee weaponry, Immortal Unchained is a third-person shooter with the bulk of the action taking the form of ranged combat. There are still some token melee weapons to use for when things get a little up close and personal, but the main draw here are the firearms. And it's the weapons themselves that you find throughout the world that will drastically affect your character's ability and performance. You'll need ammo to fire your weapon, which isn't infinite, so conserving it for the more crucial encounters is a factor. Most weapons also have a special ability that can usually one-shot regular enemies but consumes mana in order to use, so again, there's some level of resource management at play here. Everything is replenished when you rest at shrines, which act as this game's version of bonfires or checkpoints. But strangely, it's only here that you can change your weapons and swap your loadouts, etc. Bit of an odd design choice if you ask me, but maybe it has something to do with balance in the game. There's light leveling to get involved with stats that you can increase to make your character stronger, but there aren't any armor or shields to help boost defense, etc. It all comes down to what weapon loadouts you're rocking, and to be fair to it, there is a ton to discover. Most enemies can feel like damage sponges, especially late in the game, but luckily a lot of them do have these glowing weak spots that if directly fired upon, do much more harm than usual. A quick dodge round the back of them as they're coming in for an attack usually exposes their glowing regions for you to pop a few rounds in, rinse and repeat. So in the end, for a lot of the boss fights I ended up adopting the same tactic, which did feel a little samey as the game went on, but for the most part was still a bunch of fun to play through. It's not a AAA game and can feel a little janky at times with occasional texture pop-ins, but if you can look past that kind of stuff, you'll find a decent Souls-like with a moody atmosphere. Elex is a science and fantasy-themed third-person action RPG set on a post-apocalyptic planet of Magalan. Its mix of fantasy and advanced technology is what sets this game out from the crowd, and it's easily its biggest draw. Having been hit by a comet, the mass destruction that followed on planet Magalan was inevitable, but it also brought with it a mysterious and extremely powerful resource called Elex. The remaining survivors on the planet organised themselves into factions, each with a different vision of the future and distinct ways of utilising Elex. The Berserkers rejected all forms of tech and purified Elex into mana to obtain natural magical powers. The Outlaws are a bunch of bandits that want only profit and freedom. They use Elex as a type of drug. And the Clerics are staunch believers of a god called Kalan and are most knowledgeable and technologically advanced of the three main factions. However, all three factions share a common enemy in the Albs, ex-clerics who decided the best course of action was to consume the Elex directly, making them incredibly strong at the cost of their emotions. You'll play as Jax, an Alb commander on a special mission who is shot down over enemy territory. Knocked out for days, Jax eventually comes to and realises that the Elex in his system has been flushed out and his natural human emotions return. As you come across various members from different factions, you'll constantly be making choices whether to help or hinder those you come into contact with. Which factions you choose to align yourself with is also a key element of the game as you delve deeper into the mystery of this world. You'll have bladed weapons as well as firearms at your disposal, with magic also becoming an option as the game progresses. There's a certain level of Euro jank to Elex's performance, and at first the combat can feel a little stilted and clunky, but that quickly becomes less of an issue as you familiarise yourself with the mechanics and level up your character. Also, the world in which this is set and the lore that accompany it go a long way in carrying this game. It's vast and expansive, and the fact that you have 3 different factions to choose from means there's no way you'll experience everything this game has to offer in just one playthrough. Player choice is a big selling point to most RPGs, and Elex is no different, but it's baked into pretty much every aspect of the game. It all funnels down into what kind of ending will be available to you. A lot of RPGs give you the illusion of choice, but few manage to make you weigh up almost every decision. It is starting to show its age a little here and there, and as mentioned, even at the time of release, the jank was ever present, so if that's an immediate turn-off for you, then it's probably best to give this one a miss. But if you can look past that, what you'll find is a huge and distinct world begging to be explored, and a story that hit more than a few highs, with some genuine surprises along the way. Not the last game you'll see on this list from this underrated dev studio, Battle Chasers Nightwar from Airship Syndicate is a modern take on the classic turn-based RPGs of old, and does a fantastic job of bringing that classic formula up to date with some neat twists and tweaks. Originally based on a comic book series, the game follows a cast of characters from that franchise as they explore dungeons, loot chests, craft items, and upgrade themselves out of the perils they find themselves in. The game starts with a small band of warriors becoming marooned on an island after their airship is shot down. A few interactions with the local townsfolk later, and you come to the realisation that this mysterious island is actually harbouring some massive reserves of mana. Because of this, all sorts of unsavoury characters have descended to the island too, looking to harvest this magical resource for themselves. There's a bit more to the plot than that, but that's the crux of it, and to be honest, it isn't anything that out of the ordinary when it comes to fantasy RPG narratives. Having a maximum of 3 in your party at any given time, with additional members being introduced as the story develops, you'll pick your favourite 3 to explore the world with. There's a swordsmith, a war golem, a rogue, a mage, and a young girl from important lineage that has inherited a pair of magical gauntlets. Enemies you encounter also have a maximum of 3 members, and battles are fought in a classic turn-based fashion. The combat systems in place are very easy to get to grips with. Whether you're a fan of the genre or not, it's all pretty easy to wrap your head around early on. But that's not to say that it doesn't ramp up in complexity and difficulty as the game progresses. There's actually a surprising amount of depth to the combat mechanics that don't immediately make themselves known, which I think is a really good thing. Like how magic abilities that come with various buffs and debuffs will cost mana, while standard attacks don't, but will instead build up an overcharge meter. This overcharge meter can be utilised and exploited to use abilities that usually eat into your mana reserves, saving your precious magic stockpile for the trickier fights further into the dungeon. The game is divided into two modes essentially. There's a top-down view adopted for world map exploration, while you travel from town to town. Here enemy encounters are clearly visible and can be engaged with or avoided as you see fit. Then there's the towns themselves and the numerous dungeons filled with enemies and loot where the perspective changes to a more isometric viewpoint. Entering these dungeons also presents a cool twist in that just before you enter you're given a choice in difficulty. Depending on what you choose will determine the enemy variety and what kind of loot will be available to you once inside. It's presented with a gorgeous art style and the character and enemy designs are all fantastic, as you'd expect from an established comic book series, but the animations of those characters during battle and even the 2D stills during dialogue segments are all top tier and look amazing. This brilliant little indie RPG is not one to ignore if you like turn-based battle systems. Immortal Shell by American indie developers Cold Symmetry is a third-person action RPG heavily focusing on melee combat where you'll control one of several shells each coming with their own unique playstyles. There was a huge amount of hype before this game released in 2020 and like in so many instances where expectations are set a little too high, it can inevitably lead to disappointment. Unfortunately, I think that's what happened with Immortal Shell. It was definitely striving for that Souls-like feel, but there are considerable changes that the dev team implemented that ensured this wouldn't just be a carbon copy. With a production value that seems to punch far above its weight, it manages to nail that foreboding atmosphere that has become synonymous with the Dark Souls brand and set itself apart from the now many Souls-likes out there. In fact, the dark and often terrifying atmosphere is one of the game's biggest strengths. Starting the game as a naked and barren entity, you search for a shell to inhabit that comes with its own playstyle and abilities. Player progression is achieved via gathering resources from defeated enemies that gradually reveals more of that particular shell's history and backstory. Through that knowledge, you can then increase certain parameters and stats of that shell and made it a genuinely unique form of character progression and character development. Combat-wise, it's very deliberate and weighty, and the combat animations themselves were great considering it was made by a 15-member team of developers. A lot of the movesets have a longer wind-up than most Souls-like, so picking your moment to attack is even more crucial here, as from the jump the enemies you encounter hit very hard, so leaving yourself exposed can and will prove to be fatal. The general sound design in this game is also worth mentioning. Playing it with headphones just amplifies the overall atmosphere and impact of every swing of your sword. Another mechanical feature that sets this game apart from others within the Souls-like genre is the harden ability that your character possesses. There isn't a shield for you to block with, but with a quick press of a button at just the right time can turn your entire body into a hardened shell of stone. An enemy hitting you in this state won't deal any damage and will instead have his attack swiftly repelled, giving you a short window to strike back in kind. You can even activate your hardened ability after initiating an attack animation. This takes priority, momentarily pausing your attack until you are hit by an enemy, at which point the attack animation resumes. Playing around with this mechanic and mastering it will be vital at seeing the game through to its final moments. Maybe a victim of overhype, this got very mixed and middling reviews at the time of launch, which I think is a massive disservice to this moody indie Souls-like. You can still find the OG PS4 version for cheap and is well worth checking out. There is also an enhanced edition that has since released for PS5 and Xbox Series consoles.
Remember, certain skulls are every bit as resistant as we are.
Who are you? What do you mean by skull?
You truly are a newborn. I should have realized.
Wait. You are the woman from the bar. Are you like me. Can you help me?
I believe, sir, I already have.
Vampyr is a third-person action RPG with detective crime-solving elements and set in London in 1918. You'll play as Jonathan Reed, a field doctor returning to London after his service during the First World War. Only he wakes to find himself in a mass grave and definitely not dead. Jonathan is now a vampire and after a tragic opening scene is desperate to find out who did this to him. Realising this epidemic is sweeping through London and with the help of a surgeon who knows his secret, he enlists his medical services to a hospital in the East End. Here he learns more about the plague's origins as well as others who share a similar biological situation to his own. You'll be given quests to go on where you can defeat vampires, cleansing the city streets and levelling up in the process, but this is only minimal. The real trick to levelling up is to give in to your newfound vampiric desires and devour the citizens of London. The more you know of a person, the more XP you gain from killing them, so it pays to be patient and observant in order to get the most out of your meal. Getting to know them intimately before chomping on them will net you a massive amount of XP that you can use to unlock further deadly abilities. Basically, the more evil you become, the more powerful you become, the easier the game gets. Want to be true and kind to those around you and hang on to any humanity that might still remain? You're welcome to do so, and there's even a trophy in it for you, but the game becomes a lot more difficult should you wish to play the hero. The combat is definitely borrowing from the Soulsborne genre, most specifically Bloodborne, but maybe that's down to its gothic setting and atmosphere too. Either way, I definitely had flashbacks of Bloodborne whilst playing this, which in my book is never a bad thing. Vampyr relies heavily on its story to keep momentum and does so fantastically well. It's completely captivating throughout, as is the voice performance of the actor playing Jonathan. I do have to mention that there is a lot of talking in this game. It's very wordy. You could even argue that there's more dialogue to it than there is combat, and if the characters were any less realised, it would probably fall flat on its face. But the fact that they're all brilliantly scripted and acted makes the world that much more believable and engrossing. It's creepy and unique, and definitely not one to overlook.
I'm not sure I can defeat them without becoming stronger. To drink blood is so tempting.
Please, we have nothing to give you. I do not wish to fight.
I have an artifact, old man.
No, Grandpa, don't do it.
We are not Corwins, child. This is the only law, and we must obey it. Let's get it over with, stranger.
Clash Artifacts of Chaos is a third-person semi-open world action RPG with an emphasis on martial arts. If you've played the recent God of War games, you'll feel right at home with its close over-the-shoulder camera and weighty melee combat. With an art style that regularly surprises with just how gross it can look, there's still an undeniable charm and beauty to this world and the strange beings that inhabit it. Set in the completely foreign and alien world of Xenozoic, you'll play the game as a recluse named Pseudo. One day, Pseudo finds a young bird-like creature known only as the Boy, whose grandfather and protector has been killed in a dispute. In this world, disputes or disagreements are settled by a game of dice called the Ritual, which at first glance might resemble something like Yahtzee but is actually a whole lot more intriguing. When you encounter enemies out in the world, you can challenge them to the Ritual. Here, you and your opponent will choose a so-called artifact of chaos that comes with either buffs or debuffs, but won't actually affect the ritual game itself, rather the physical battle that will follow it. Depending on who wins, the whole point of the ritual, from a gameplay perspective, is to provide either an advantage or disadvantage to the player during the melee battle. One artifact I had that I like to use meant that should I win the ritual, my opponent will be continuously stung by wasps if he ever stopped moving during our battle encounter. Combat has a heft to it that I really liked, and with it being an RPG, you can tailor it to your playstyle to a certain degree. There's not 1,000,001 different stats you can min-max here, but there is enough to keep it interesting. There are different fighting stances that, as well as moves and combos, can all be upgraded and provide quite a mixed bag of martial art techniques. Beat some opponents around enough and a special mode will be triggered where you can pummel the enemy in a first-person brawl, which was hilarious when I first experienced it and to be honest never got old and always felt satisfying. I bought this game on a whim, mainly because of the ridiculous looking character models on the front cover of the box art. I was hoping for an okay game with some unconventional artwork, but what I got ended up being an incredible and memorable gaming experience. Don't sleep on this one, it's absurdly brilliant.
I will feed you to the fish!
Knowing you, you're definitely involved. But something tells me I know you better than you knew yourself. Don't you remember me? I'm hurt. No time for introductions now. The Tuatha are still on the move.
Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning is a remastered version of 2012's action RPG Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, which originally released for PS3, Xbox 360 and PC. The game's very storied past and checkered development is definitely something to look into if you have an interest in game development at all, but it is too long of a yarn to spin here. I'll include a link to an article in the video description if anyone's interested. Taking place in the fantasy world of the Feylands, where all things follow a destined path dictated by the Fate Weave, a group of gifted individuals called Fate Weavers are able to read and report on the paths depicted by the Fate Weave. With the current age the game is set in being called the Age of Arcana, a time of unknown magic is beginning to manifest. You'll customize a character at the beginning of the game to become the Fateless One, with each race offering unique boosts to different attributes and passive enhancements. You'll be navigating the open areas or crawling through dungeons as you complete main and side quests and converse with NPCs, all while gathering loot and XP as you do so, further enhancing your character's abilities. It's all fairly standard stuff that you'd expect with a game like this, and it doesn't really push the envelope in any of these areas, but it does nonetheless provide a very comforting experience due to this familiarity. The action is real-time and focuses primarily on either melee or magic-based combat. You'll gain access to a variety of fantasy weapons, swords, daggers, bows, hammers, etc., while magic and equipable active skills can be unlocked via skill trees and activated using an MP meter. Activating an assortment of attack abilities will gradually fill a fate meter, and filling it will grant you the ability to trigger Reckoning mode. This temporarily slows down time for everyone on the battlefield except for you, allowing you to blitz through the crowd unimpeded until the fate meter runs out. There's crafting, lockpicking, blacksmithing, etc. that will all keep you busy when not in combat, and these can all be leveled up and improved as you progress through the game too. In fact, there's a surprising amount of mechanics packed into this, and while they might not be anything revolutionary, certainly provide an authentic Western RPG experience, and with this remaster is still very enjoyable to play through today.
Look who it is. Strife.
You know who I am?
Yeah. I met your sister once. She was a lot bigger than you. But not as pretty. What do you want, little horse man?
Darksiders Genesis is a top-down hack-and-slash action RPG and the fourth game to be released in the Darksiders franchise. Considered a spin-off/prequel of sorts, it's a return to form in my eyes and could easily be argued as the best game the series has to offer. Shedding its previous third-person perspective for a more top-down isometric angle, it does at first glance resemble yet another Diablo clone, but it still manages to hold on to that distinct Darksiders DNA, and most crucially, the combat system they developed here is incredibly good fun and just as addictive. The plot will introduce the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, Strife, as the main protagonist, but you'll also have his brother War to call upon and play as too. The horsemen are summoned by the council and are informed of their suspicion regarding Lucifer's plans to upset the balance, ordering War and Strife to investigate, which is pretty much a green light to work your way deeper and deeper into the underworld, slaying anything and everything as you slowly uncover the truth. Switching between War and Strife as and when you please is handy, as their playstyles and attack types differ quite considerably, with some enemy types being more susceptible to one over the other. They differ in almost every way and will require you to utilise both in order to solve puzzles and become victorious in battle. Strife dual wields his two pistols Mercy and Redemption and is generally a bit quicker on his feet, while War uses a greatsword called Chaos Eater and wears heavy armour slowing him down slightly, but is awarded greater poise to inflict bigger damage whilst also being able to sustain taking more damage himself. Switching between them is instantaneous, and the game also provides a co-op mode allowing two players to rampage through hell together. There's passive buffs too, like how when you kill enough enemies a burst-like ability kicks in, allowing you to eliminate even more at a faster rate, clearing those in your path in a much more efficient manner. Souls can be earned by killing enemies, which can be spent on a basic leveling system, and this time around you're introduced to creature cores, dynamic abilities that can be inserted into your skill tree and enhanced further by collecting gems and more of the same type of creature cores. There's a return to the platforming sections from the game's previous entries and even some other franchise favourite gameplay mechanics like throwing bombs to clear pathways. The boss designs are memorable and their encounters were some of the game's highlights, especially as the campaign reaches its conclusion. Some of them were a genuine struggle to overcome, requiring me to farm souls to make my duo of apocalyptic horsemen that little bit more formidable, but even that was welcomed as playing through this was just such an enjoyable breeze. With around 16 chapters to play through that increase in length and difficulty as you go, there's a fairly sizable chunk of game to sink your teeth into here, plus a ton of replayability value with the added co-op mode. But if that wasn't enough, the game also includes a wave-based arena for you to test your mettle and hone your skills. Airship Syndicate have yet again knocked it out the park in my opinion, and much like the games I've covered of theirs that are featured on this list, need a lot more praise and recognition if you ask me. Star Renegades is a turn-based roguelite strategy RPG that spans generations and dimensions through a gorgeous looking sci-fi universe. The developers have created an incredibly detailed HD 2D world, giving it an almost 3D diorama effect, all drenched in vibrant neon and pastels and exploding with detail. After a gorgeous animated intro providing some backstory, you're released into the world and are soon apprehended by a service robot who has travelled from another dimension. Explicitly seeking you out, it warns you of an impending doom from an overwhelming force known as the Imperium. It falls to you and the motley crew of travellers you find to bring an end to the Imperium's relentless crusade through the galaxies. This is achieved through a battle system that can be a little daunting in the game's opening few hours, as there is genuinely quite a lot to cover, so expect plenty of tutorial text windows. However, once I understood what the game was asking of me and settled into a rhythm, I personally felt like this was one of the best new turn-based battle systems I had played in a long while. Once you pick a fight with someone, the battle system that you enter is governed by a timeline displayed at the top of the screen that all participants of the fight are ruled by. This provides a view of the sequence at which each member will execute an action. However, certain attacks and actions can interrupt and drastically change the placement of enemies, moving them further down the timeline. Push them all the way off it completely and a break will occur, essentially muting the enemy and rendering them useless for that turn, which is excellent for example when a boss you're fighting is charging up for a heavy AoE attack. It makes each fight a lot more reactive and tactical in my opinion, and rather than just relying on heavy attacks to brute strength your way through enemies, it emphasises the use of interrupts and counters and generally requires more thought. There are tons of characters to unlock and recruit, each with their own unique abilities and personalities, and the bonds you make with them will strengthen all involved. This is done at the end of each day in a camping sequence. Restoring health, increasing armor, or leveling up attacks can all be done whilst camping using specific cards that can be found in the overworld whilst exploring. Limited actions available whilst camping will determine who you spend the cards on within your party, but whoever you choose will not only benefit from that card's attributes, they will also be strengthened from having a closer relationship to you. There's a lot to like about this game and a ton I haven't mentioned, like the intelligent adversary system which generates unique enemies and bosses that evolve and move up the ranks as you play, not a million miles from what Shadow of Mordor was doing. Or the hidden areas that appear once certain conditions are met, hiding more exposition to the game's story and rare loot inside. Or even how neatly the game's roguelite procedurally generated mechanics are interwoven into the narrative and given an in-world explanation. I could go on, but I'll leave the rest for you to discover should you pick it up. Flawless pixel art style and a battle system that felt fresh and engaging. I can't recommend Star Renegades enough if turn-based games are your thing. Lords of the Fallen 2014 is an action RPG developed by Deck 13 Interactive and considered by many to be the first big budget Souls-like. The game is set in a world long after the defeat of a god named Adir that formerly ruled humanity with an iron fist. Defeated by three heroes, a rogue, a cleric and a warrior, that later became known as the Judges, they were elevated to demigod status after their triumph. Taking the role of a convicted criminal, you are released from prison by a monk named Kaslo in order to stop a mysterious invasion of Adir's demonic forces, the Rogar. Rogar lords represent the powerful generals of this invading force, and putting them back in their place provides the game's epic boss battles. The combat is slow and deliberate and an exercise in patience. Not only do you have to memorise enemy movesets like many other games from this subgenre, but you have to recalibrate your thinking if you happen to be a fan of the Soulsborne series, as hitboxes differ quite drastically, as does the speed at which attack animations play out. It does however have a great art style that's detailed and really well fleshed out. From the lighting to the oppressive environments, it definitely sells that fantasy medieval setting well. It might not have that same level of terrifying atmosphere that the original Souls series had, or even Mortal Shell for that matter, but considering this was the first big budget Souls-like to have been released, they certainly put a lot of effort into its presentation and it shows in almost every area. The enemy designs, including bosses, are well thought out, if a little samey. Most bosses adopt that larger than life angry knight clad in armour approach, which was a little disappointing, but what was cool is shredding that armour off piece by piece as you deal damage to them. The movesets of your character was good too, especially given the many weapon types available to you. But I do remember at the time when I first played this back in 2015 or 16, it was soon after my first playthrough of Bloodborne, and coming from that to this felt like my character in Lords of the Fallen was moving underwater. Everything was so much slower and heavier. A swing of your sword in this game takes a few more precious seconds to complete a full swing. The dodge roll seemed like you were rolling through treacle. And that's not even because you were overburdened, just the standard roll is that slow in this game. It took quite a while for me to settle into a groove with this game, but ultimately when I did, I really enjoyed my time with it. There's stats to level up, epic loot to find, shortcuts to unlock and NPCs to converse with, all the mainstays of a good RPG. It's a little rough around the edges that might prove too rough for some, but the utter lambasting this game got on release, and even to this day, I feel is a little unjust. It also provided the necessary stepping stone developers Deck 13 needed to finally tune their approach to the Souls-like subgenre, more of which we'll hear about later on in this list. The more recent reboot of this, which confusingly has the exact same name, is probably, well, definitely a better game, so if you can only pick one, go for that. But considering how cheap you can find the original, it's well worth picking up and sampling if you have a taste for that Souls-like formula.
Before the Guardians were not beasts feeding, but monsters consuming, destroying others. They corrupted and distorted, creating even more hungry husks.
Children of Morta is a deceptively tough action RPG with roguelike elements, using a beautifully detailed pixel art style and a genuinely engrossing and well-written story. The game follows the Bergson family, caretakers of Mount Morta who are entrusted with defending it against the corruption spreading through Morta and beyond. You'll gain control of pretty much all the members of the large Bergson clan through story progression, and each have their own unique abilities, making each run feel different. That, coupled with the dungeons themselves being procedurally generated, makes no two runs ever feel the same. Aside from it being one of the best examples of pixel art graphics out there, its gameplay is slick, responsive and highly addictive. It's a roguelike, so you do lose the buffs and power-ups you've accumulated in a run if you die, but there are certain things that you do hold on to, such as the XP earned through combat and the game's currency, which you'll use back at the Bergson's residence to level up certain aspects of your character. And the best thing about this is that while each member of the family levels up individually using XP gained through combat during runs, the leveling up done back at the Bergson's residence, health, strength and speed for example, applies to all playable characters. Occasionally you'll enter an area of the dungeon and a special type of battle will commence, preceded by a short cutscene. These aren't crucial to progression but usually impact the story in some form or another, rewarding you with a cutscene back at home when you next return, or additions to the residence itself that further flesh out an already incredibly rich and detailed world. Story-wise, I'm going to keep it super brief as it surprised me how good it was, and I'd want the same experience for any of you who decide to pick this up. I'll just say this though, it packs an emotional punch that most narrative-driven games could only dream of achieving. For an indie action RPG roguelite, the story completely blew me away and is something I recommend everyone experience.
Given to the Bergsons by Rhea herself, the sanctuary was a gateway to the mysterious lands around the mountain.
The Banner Saga is a turn-based tactical RPG taking place in a Norse mythology-inspired world where all the gods that once reigned supreme have seemingly fallen. You'll control a caravan of men and Viking-like giant warriors known as Varl as they traverse the land, battling a warlike race named the Dredge, known for their bitter hatred of humans and their longing for dominion over the world. Told through the eyes of two playable characters whose separate stories eventually converge into one, the outcome of which will be determined by your actions and choices throughout your playthrough. You'll build a party of characters whose strengths and abilities complement each other and will have to make many challenging decisions to determine the fate of your party and learn to live with the consequences. Everything feels deliberate in this game, even the many mistakes you'll inevitably make. Nothing is black and white in this world. Even the relationship between humans and the mythical Varl, whose shared loathing of the Dredge and the monumental task before them still isn't enough to settle their petty differences. Politics, ethical dilemmas, morale of the party, and even the caravan's supplies are in constant need of your attention, and dealing with the problems that arise with as little collateral damage as possible to the group is something you'll have to manage often. There's no right or wrong path to take with a lot of the situations you find yourself in. The uneasy ambiguity is something this game strives for, and not only does it pull it off, it's all the better for it. Play the hero and the game will not have a problem punishing you for it later down the line. You can train and level up certain characters, and their development and journey make them that much more endearing and likeable. Also, the writing helps a great deal as it's superb and makes you care for each and every one of them that much more. With up to 6 playable characters entering a battle, you'll strategically place them around a grid-based battlefield, ensuring they're in the optimal position to deal the most damage respective of their abilities. Most enemies have health and armor meters, and different attack types by your party will either whittle down one or the other. Removing the armor of an enemy means that the follow-up attacks concentrating on health will be much more efficient and eliminate them sooner. But in the Banner Saga, health and strength is one and the same. An enemy with 10 health, for example, will also deal 10 damage, so it's in your interest to at least reduce the health of the larger enemies you're up against, as it will in turn reduce the amount of damage you take should they get close enough. Deciding who to eliminate from the battlefield first plays a big role, as you can very quickly become overwhelmed if the wrong choice is made. Its mournful approach to storytelling, the painfully deliberate turn-based combat, and the simplistic yet beautiful art style make this a genuinely unique experience, and any fan of Final Fantasy Tactics or similar games should definitely seek this trilogy out.
Lively there, lads and lasses! I promised the merchants and their prince we'd be off before the tide. You, man, carry that properly. That porcelain is worth more than your life. There are some children we'd been best to refuse.
Greedfall is an 18th century fantasy epic about colonization, politics, and big scary monsters, that while not breaking any new ground in the genre, certainly provides an undeniable appeal and for the most part a thoroughly enjoyable experience. You'll play as Darksiders, a pre-written character that can either be male or female depending on which one you select in character creation. You'll explore a newly discovered and remote island called Tier 3D that is teeming with fantastical and supernatural beings. As a noble of the merchant congregation, Darksiders is of a fairly high social standing in these bleak and brutal times, and your words and actions hold a fair amount of sway. Which is handy, as your main objective in this new world is to uncover a potential cure for a deadly plague sweeping across Darksiders' homeland. With colonial forces from several distinct nations all vying to conquer this new uncharted territory, you'll make decisions and influence people using a combination of diplomacy and combat that not only affects the direction the game's story will take you on, but also the relationship between the differing factions already established on the island. Combat is your fairly standard third-person action that you've probably seen 100 times already during this gen, and can often feel a little clunky if I'm being completely honest. But what it lacks in finesse, it more than makes up for in player options, and there is a lot to play around with here. There's melee, firearms, magic, and traps that can all be utilised to turn the tide in battle encounters. On the RPG side of things, Greedfall almost encourages mixing things up over prioritising one particular playstyle too, which I found really pleasing. Certain enemies are receptive to a particular damage type, so it was nice to know that I could spread out my acquired skill points to cover all bases without being penalised by the game. There's also a tactical pause mechanic that can be activated at any point in battle, allowing you to casually select potions, spells, or techniques, etc., or just to give you a few minutes to gather yourself and re-evaluate your strategy. The world building, characters, and sense of exploration are where this game shines in my opinion. It was engaging throughout with a genuine sense of intrigue that isn't even a guarantee from games made by much bigger studios. Here I feel the devs really outdid themselves, as I genuinely loved combing through every inch of this world. There is some jank to the game though, as previously mentioned, as well as a few occasional bugs, so if that sort of thing immediately puts you off, then you might want to give this one a miss. I'm personally quite forgiving when it comes to that sort of thing, so it didn't really get in the way of me enjoying it. A beautiful world and time period to set the game, this underrated little gem is not one to ignore.
You remember our deal, don't you? This contract will resurrect you in service to me. In return, you must do something for me. Give it time. For now, just sign here. In blood, of course.
Death's Gambit came out in 2018 to a relatively decent critical reception and was championed by those that enjoy a challenging but rewarding action-adventure experience. Inspired by Dark Souls and Castlevania, Death's Gambit arrived at a time when 2D Souls-likes and Metroidvanias were already really booming, and while this was loved by those who played it, I do feel like it got kinda lost in the weeds a little. However, in 2021, 3 years after its initial launch, Death's Gambit Afterlife was released, a free update that was a massively expanded and revised version of the game that now features 10 new levels, over 20 new weapons, 5 or 6 new bosses I think, and huge mechanical overhauls both in combat and its vastly deep RPG systems. It might be the greatest free content update I've ever encountered. You'll play as Soren, a soldier sent to a place called Alduin to locate the source of immortality. Unfortunately for Soren and his brothers in arms, this will be their last expedition as they are all killed by the inhabitants of Alduin, the immortal Endless. Death soon arrives to claim the souls of the fallen soldiers, but in the process notices Soren and decides to offer him the gift of immortality in return for his services. Playing as born-again Soren, you'll be sent on your way to explore Alduin and discover its secrets, with the main aim being to eventually discover the source of immortality. There's plenty of lore in this game, and Afterlife does a much better job at establishing the world and Soren's origins so that as the player you feel way more invested in the story, even more so now that all cutscenes are fully voiced, further enhancing immersion. There's a ton to discover too across its 20 different locations, and its map with its classic design is sprawling, unravelling more the further you explore. There's hidden pathways, optional enemies, loot and trinkets to discover, with some areas unreachable until you acquire the necessary ability, usually by defeating bosses. Each area feels massive and enticing, begging you to explore every nook and cranny, and I haven't even mentioned the class select at the beginning, each coming with considerably different playstyles that change the feel of combat significantly. Or the incredibly deep leveling system, RPG mechanics and craft systems at play here that made character progression seamless and addictive. The combat is fast and responsive, the enemy designs and attack patterns are varied and challenging. It's just such an incredible 2D Metroidvania RPG. One that any fan of those genres definitely needs in their collection. Remnant from the Ashes is the second Souls with Guns game on this list, but is undoubtedly the better of the two in my opinion. A third-person shooter that encapsulates many of the fundamental mechanics of the Souls-like genre, like a high skill ceiling, stamina management, intense boss fights, and character progression, etc. The game is set in a post-apocalyptic Earth that has been devastated and overrun by an interdimensional evil tree-like entity known as the Root. You'll play as a customizable character and wandering survivor of the apocalypse, driven to put an end to the Root by travelling to a tower on an island that appears to be at the epicenter of the invasion. You'll soon discover Ward 13, an underground bunker where humanity's stragglers can hide and live out their days in relative comfort. Acting as a sort of hub area for the player, you can upgrade your weapons here as well as your character before you eventually head back out to the Root-blighted world above. The levels are procedurally generated, but the story itself follows a linear path. You can play with up to 2 more friends in a robust co-op mode or play through it solo. Joining a friends game means you won't make any story progression of your own, but you can keep all the goodies and loot you find along the way, which can impact and help with your own story playthrough. You can wield up to 2 firearms at any given time, a main weapon and a sidearm, as well as a melee weapon for when things get a little CQC. The weapons available at first are slightly limited to the standard pistols, rifles and shotguns you'd expect in any shooter, but once bosses are defeated, that will grant you access to more fantastical and devastating weaponry. The RPG side of things comes into effect with customizing your armor and upgrading the firearms in your arsenal. Passive enhancements can be gained via unlockable traits, and mods can be added to the available slots that will further enhance the weapon's damage output or grant additional abilities. One fundamental difference between this and other Souls-likes is what happens upon death, a frequent occurrence in this game. Instead of losing all that you have accumulated on your run, you are sent back to your last checkpoint, but the enemy placement, type and even amount may have changed, making sure that each and every run requires your utmost attention. Some areas of the game can feel a little bland and generic, especially the opening areas, but as the game progresses, environments switch up their visual style quite nicely and are genuinely enjoyable to explore. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for many of the game's NPCs, as only a handful were actually memorable. But it's the gameplay that you're here for, and that doesn't disappoint at all. The gunplay felt great, and its procedurally generated design means returning to areas never felt samey or boring. Developed by Gunfire Games, the dev studio behind Darksiders 2 and 3, this is a massive departure from what they're known for, but with a sequel recently released that by all accounts improves on this formula in every single way, I wouldn't be surprised to see more of this world in future entries. If you're into your third-person shooters, or are partial to the odd Souls-like, this is definitely a game to check out if you haven't already. Pillars of Eternity is an isometric top-down RPG developed by Obsidian Entertainment and is seen as a spiritual successor to the Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale series. Crowdfunded via Kickstarter, it easily became the highest funded video game at the time, due in part to the developer's long history making fantastic Western RPGs. The game takes place in the fantasy world of Eora, mainly in the nation of Drywood. Newborns in the Drywood have been plagued by a recent phenomenon in which they are hollow-born upon birth, meaning they are born with no soul. During the opening section of the game, you will experience an awakening of power and discover that you are a Watcher, a person who can see past lives and interact with the souls from the Netherrealm. The main plot direction henceforth is finding out how you were awakened and, more importantly, how to solve the hollow-born problem. The protagonist will be created by yourselves with choices made to race, background, stats and class, of which there are 11 to choose from. This in turn will impact not only your look and social standing in the world, but also what choices are made available to you when interacting with the game's many NPCs or interactive objects. Gameplay wise, it's rooted in party-based, real-time with pause tactical action, and exploration is a major part of the game too, with your 3D rendered characters moving through beautifully pre-rendered backgrounds, visiting locations that are sealed under a fog of war until you traverse through them, with new areas being unlocked as you progress the main story. There is an absolute boatload of things to see and do in this game. Aside from the obvious main and side questing, there's reputations among factions to maintain or destroy, affecting how a particular group of people would treat you when roaming through their neck of the Drywoods, and there's strongholds to take over to provide your party with a much needed base of operations too. Its biggest asset in my book, however, is the stellar writing on display. There's a lot to read through in this game, but it's also fantastically well executed that it was never a chore. Drawing heavy inspiration from D&D, Pillars of Eternity or its sequel, Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, boasts its own proprietary system of role-playing mechanics built for the game that are incredibly deep and well implemented. If you've recently played through Baldur's Gate 3 and want another similarly epic adventure to play through, then you could do a lot worse than either entries in the Pillars of Eternity series.
It's what's beneath the skin and the letters I care about. What burns within. It's more important to me you're a Watcher than whatever culture or accent decorates your letters like awkward crowns. Take pride in your actions, not where you hail from, or how your name rolls off whatever liar's tongue coats it now.
The ancient Greeks once said, "A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in." We tend to forget about this, tend to be careless, but we have to rise to the task together. It's up to all of us to sow those seeds, and it's up to us to nurture them towards growth. Creo is not just another company.
The Surge is an action role-playing game heavily inspired by the Soulsborne genre, and the second game to feature on this list from German developers Deck 13 Interactive, and in my book at least, by far their best work to date. You could argue that the sequel, The Surge 2, implements a more refined action experience, but the atmosphere of the debut entry in the series is still unrivaled in my opinion. Taking place in a dystopian future where mankind has exhausted the world's resources, leading to societal collapse, devastating environmental diseases, and coupled with the proliferation of drones and working robots creating mass unemployment, the remaining humans are forced to resort to augmentations and powered body rigs in order to have even the slightest chance at survival. You'll play as Warren and start the game boarding a bullet train to the headquarters of Creo for your first day at your new job. Creo is one of the largest tech conglomerates now controlling much of the work and renowned for its revolutionary breakthroughs in technology. However, it is most famous for its state-of-the-art exoskeletons and the launch of Project Resolve, a complex chemical formula that is dispersed via rockets to slowly reseed the Earth's damaged atmosphere, as well as boost the growth of flora the world over. However, it soon becomes clear that while Project Resolve is working, it is happening at a much slower rate than initially intended, and a swifter and deadlier course of action is required to ensure the future of mankind. This sci-fi Souls-like was an absolute blast to play through, and you can clearly see how Deck 13 implemented the lessons learned from making Lords of the Fallen. Everything feels much quicker, hitboxes are more refined, animations are more fluid, it just nails that crunchy melee combat without it feeling clunky. There's way more interconnecting level design at play here too, something I always loved about exploring in the Souls games, almost getting just as much of an endorphin rush from linking two distant areas as I did when defeating a tough boss. The boss battles in this don't disappoint either, even if some felt a little gimmicky at times, but it's the targeted body part mechanic that is by far the coolest addition to this formula for me. When up against an enemy, you have the ability to select which part of their body to focus your attacks on. You can go for the legs, arms, torso and head, and if severed correctly can claim that piece of armour or weaponry for yourself. Getting bested by a tough enemy with a killer new weapon, learning their attack patterns or returning once stronger to eventually defeat them and take that weapon for yourself was brilliantly addictive. It's a great mechanical addition that makes fighting even low-level grunts a joy. Even if you don't want anything from them, severing their head clean off and watching it fly off in slow motion never got old. Another thing worth noting is the brilliant sound design. The noise your rig makes as it moves, the howl of some of the grotesque enemies, and the grinding metal that accompanies your weapon slicing through anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in your way was just top tier. This is still one of my favourite Souls-likes out there even after all these years, combining my favourite genre of any medium, sci-fi, with my favourite type of action gameplay, i.e. the Soulsborne formula. I was probably always going to love this, but if that sounds anything like you and you haven't dived in on this yet, I highly recommend it. Described by someone once as the best book they'd ever played, Torment Tides of Numenera is more of a rich sci-fi fantasy novel than it is a traditional video game. The reason it features so high on this list is testament to just how well the story is told. I found this almost impossible to put down. I spoke to pretty much everyone I came across, as even the smallest of NPCs had such rich dialogue to dish out that I feverishly gathered up information on this world from anything and everyone that I could. Being the backbone of the entire game, it would need stellar writing, and I can safely say that this has some of the best writing and story development of any game I've ever played. Acting as a spiritual successor to 1999's Planescape Torment and set in the Ninth World, a sci-fi fantasy campaign setting written and created by Monty Cook for his tabletop RPG Numenera. This is yet another Kickstarter success story, with it reaching its funding a mere 6 hours after the project's launch. Set in the incredibly far future, around 1 billion years from now, the rise and fall of countless civilizations has left the Earth in an almost medieval state, with most of humanity living in simple settlements surrounded by technological relics of the mysterious past. Called the Ninth World by scholars, it is believed that 8 great ages have been and gone since the time the game is set, leaving behind ruins and artifacts that are known as Numenera. They represent the science and technology of these past civilizations, and while most are irreparably broken, some still offer some functionality but are beyond the level of understanding of most humans who believe these objects to be magical in nature. You'll play as the last cast-off, the final vessel for the consciousness of an ancient man who managed to find a way to leave his physical body and be reborn in a new one, pretty much achieving a kind of immortality. The ancient man, also known as the Changing God, has attracted the attention of the Sorrow, whose now sole purpose is to seek and destroy him and his creations. Playing as the last cast-off, one of the Changing God's creations, you must find your master before it's too late. You'll explore the Ninth World, finding other cast-offs like yourself, make friends and enemies along the way, and even experience different worlds and dimensions through the lives of others that have walked the Earth. It's high fantasy and hard sci-fi expertly rolled into one. A lot of the characters are so ambiguous in their intentions that it's hard to make a choice you're perfectly happy with, which I really loved about it. There is combat in the game and it functions much like a turn-based RPG, but depending on what route you take your particular cast-off down, you could easily bypass a lot of these encounters altogether by simply talking your way out of them or outsmarting your opponents before a weapon is even drawn. I had an ability that allowed me to interpret the inner thoughts of almost anyone, so I had a much better understanding of a particular character's desires even before a word was spoken between us. This is such a nice change of pace from almost all other games on this list, but would have fallen flat on its face had the writing not been the exceptionally high standard that it is. If contemplative sci-fi and philosophical dilemmas pique your interest, then definitely pick this one up the next time you see it.
A mortal gnat snaps its jaws at the Lord of Locusts. Behold, Iomane. Behold the death I sow.
The Pathfinder series from Owlcat Games are isometric action RPGs that focus on that D&D video game formula of real-time with pause, much like Pillars of Eternity. But unlike Pillars of Eternity, should you prefer straight-up turn-based combat, this has that implemented too, and switching between them is incredibly easy. Both games released so far, Pathfinder Kingmaker and this, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, could be considered for this list, but if you were only to pick one, then it would have to be Wrath of the Righteous. Creases were ironed out, lessons learned, and on the whole is a much more enjoyable and less buggy experience. Based on the popular tabletop RPG of the same name, the game is set in the country of Mendev, which has been waging a series of wars against the World Wound, a magical portal that allows demons to travel from their home in the Abyss to the mortal world. These wars, also known as Crusades, have been slowly losing ground, primarily because any demons killed in the mortal world return to life in the Abyss. You'll control a citizen from the city of Canabres on Mendev's outskirts. After surviving a demonic invasion of the city, you soon discover that you have strange mythical powers bestowed upon you from an unknown source. After driving the demons out of Canabres, you'll be made a commander of the 5th Crusade by Queen Galfrey. As you retake territory from the demons, you'll add and recruit various characters to your party, and as your mythic powers grow, the game will slowly set you on one of several mythic paths, such as becoming an angel, trickster, or lich, for example. The choices made along this path will significantly affect your abilities, leadership style, and even fate. The story is well written, but it's the incredible amount of choice given to you as the player that allows you to shape this world and therefore the narrative that deserves the biggest praise. Another cool aspect of the game is how recruitment for your party works. There'll be numerous characters presented to you through the main campaign that can join your party. Neglect them or shun them in some way and they can turn on you later down the line. Alternatively, you can do away with them altogether and, providing you have enough funds, buy mercenaries to populate your party instead. It really does present you with multiple options in every facet of this game to make it truly unique to you. The UI was also intuitive and easy to comprehend. There's a lot to get your head around, and there's even more info constantly vying for your attention, as is the case with most RPGs of this ilk. But I have to commend Owlcat for really sticking the landing here when it comes to UI design. The brilliant score and overall aesthetic from the world itself and the fantastical creatures that inhabit it does a great job at really selling that high fantasy environment, keeping you constantly immersed. I can't believe how little I hear about this game, considering just how excellent it is. If you happen to be into your top-down RPGs and haven't given this one a go yet, then I highly suggest seeking it out next time you're game hunting. Whether you prefer action or turn-based, this game has you covered, and I highly doubt you'll be disappointed.
Sent Ranger Team November across the Rockies, because the aid he was promising the Rangers wasn't just their best hope. It was their last.
Okay, Major. All good. Come ahead.
Wasteland 3 is an isometric turn-based strategy RPG with a huge emphasis on player choice. I can't overstate that last point enough, as you'll be making tough decisions constantly. You can play either Wasteland 2 or 3 and experience the same level of quality that In Exile brings to most if not all of their projects, but for me, Wasteland 3 is the better out of the two, and that's what I want to show you guys here today. Set in the frozen wastelands of post-apocalyptic Colorado, you'll take control of 2 members from the Arizona Rangers who survived after their unit was ambushed whilst on a mission. The 2 survivors are subsequently forced to work with the local ruler known as the Patriarch in order to earn his support. Once arrived and settled, you are given a base of operations and are tasked with hunting down and reining in the Patriarch's 3 heirs. On top of this, you'll also be fighting on his behalf to preserve his rule over the many settlements and scattered populations that make up this game's version of Colorado. However, some revelations occur that will require you to make a choice, and depending on what that choice is will determine the outcome of the game. Like with many instances in Wasteland 3, your decisions, whether in conversation or combat, have far-reaching consequences to not only the story's development, but also the world itself, and is a massive part of this game's appeal. Being the sole decision maker in the game, having to make choices during every single conversation pretty much, gave me the feeling that I had complete control over the narrative. Everyone you encounter is fleshed out and well realised, and finding and recruiting members for your new base also dramatically impacts the game. Depending on who you choose, you could have characters that liven up the place, or a bunch of miserable mercs that cause an atmosphere thicker than the sheets of ice covering Colorado. You'll also get access to a tanky vehicle which allows you to cross the vast wasteland with ease as you make your way from mission to mission. Again, how you get there is up to you, and there are many things vying for your attention along the way. This is definitely one of those games where the journey is just as important as the destination, as you are explicitly involved throughout. You can level up the skills of your party members during your playthrough that make combat exploration and bargaining easier, and the best thing is that all members of your crew can benefit from a particular skill, providing the person with the skill is included in the party. No need for everyone to have the lock-picking skill maxed out, for example. Essentially what you want is a mixed bag of skilled wastelanders that can give you better odds of getting out of tricky situations. Definitely don't skip this one if you like deep and rich story beats that you genuinely feel a part of, or are into your turn-based strategy games. It's absolutely fantastic.
This place rocks, right?
And there you have it guys, my personal top 20 underrated Western RPGs on the PS4. I probably could have made a top 30 list to be honest, but I've decided to make a separate video covering the 10 or so indie titles that didn't make the cut here, so keep an eye out for that in the future if there's something that might interest you. Let me know down in the comments which one of these has you most excited to try out, or if there are any criminally glaring omissions. If you enjoyed the video, then have a think about hitting the like button, as it genuinely helps out quite a bit, and subscribe if you're new to the channel. That's going to wrap things up here though, so thank you for watching, and until next time, take care, be good, game on.